Okay, hello and welcome to our Philadelphia Latino Film Festival 2024 Q&A panel session. My name's Jackie Barragan, and I work for an organization called Fem Frontera, and I'll be moderating this session. I'd like to begin by having our participant introduce themselves. If you can, please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Pamela Martinez. I'm a filmmaker born in Venezuela, currently located in California in the United States, pursuing an MFA in documentary, and I'm the director of Illegal Alien.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I just want to go ahead and jump in. I really appreciated your film. I appreciated all the symbolism around migration that you had in your film. And I wanted to ask you, I guess the first question is, what was your personal inspiration for making this film?
Thank you for your question. So as many people might know, Venezuela has been undergoing through a large wave, in multiple waves of migration through the past decade. And many of my relatives have undergone the pathway of migrated once to the southern cone, and then decided to migrate once again to the United States through land, crossing the Darien jungle, and then making it to the U.S.-Mexico border all the way through Central America. And then at this moment, they're in a shelter in New York State. At the same time, as I was doing my thesis for my capstone for my undergraduate thesis, I wanted to research migration from a psychological perspective, but also the physical aspect of migration. So I started doing sociological research because I also have I studied sociology also in my undergraduate, doing ethnographic research about what are the mechanisms through which Venezuelan women migrate. And one of them was actually marriage as a pathway to extend legality. So when I started doing interviews with women that are currently in the US, I realized that there's so much beyond the aspect of the marriage that I was interested in from an affective point of view, that I was like, oh, all of these interviews, I need to do something more with it. And then so I had my sociological paper, and then I started developing 3 short scripts that are like kind of docu-fictionalized. But then I couldn't really make them in my last year because I did my undergraduate studies in Abu Dhabi. So location-wise, it didn't work out. So then I decided to do this piece, which is kind of the prelude of what I want these 3 short pieces to become at some point my first feature film. And they're all exploring migration from different point of view. So like the next script that I want to develop is actually specifically going through the Darien jungle. And then there's another one about the process of once you have migrated, what are the challenges that women specifically face as migrants, intersecting the challenges of gender, but also migrant precarity. Yes. And I mean, as a migrant myself, also with a lot of privilege, I think it's very different. I have to recognize that from other women, when they have experienced migration through land, I still feel like the Venezuelan migratory process is a lot of mourning, the fact of living and wanting to find a sense of home, and recognizing that all of our families now are scattered around the world, and wanting to reconnect with that.
Wow, that's powerful. And you actually documented interviews with people, and can you talk more about that experience?
Yes, so I interviewed around 17 women in the beginning, and all of them, I mean, every story is a world, right? So the purpose of doing Illegal Alien is because I really wanted to explore the idea of representing some sort of like collectiveness without necessarily homogenizing women. And that's why actually the sound of the stories are from these interviews, which in the beginning I didn't expect that I was going to use a sound. So they were like very recorded with like poor technologies, if one wants to call it. Some of them were through Zoom, some of them were on my phone. But for me, the most important thing was that I could have a sense of privacy and sense of comfort, that they would feel comfortable telling me their stories, because they would know that ultimately this is something that protects their personhood in a way that it would never compromise their legal status, because they're still going in the undergoing process of staying in the US. And actually, some of them, few, have gone back. Once they migrated, they stayed, and then they decided to come back because they knew that they were better off in Venezuela.
Wow. And was it a conscious choice to use alternative imagery that you used in your film instead of showing their faces in the interviews?
Yes, because so the choice of fictionalizing the visuals was, first of all, to protect anonymity, and also open up the possibilities of talking about something more systematic within the legal system, right? Is the fact that us as migrants and refugees and asylum seekers, when we come to the US, we're given literally an alien number. And how dehumanizing is the legal system, including within international law, we get alien numbers. So that for me is kind of insane that we have this type of language and discourse when we are talking about people who are literally seeking for political and civil refuge. Yeah, and I wanted to explore that more through our visuals. Yeah.
It's amazing. That really was clear in the visuals. And I want specifically something that stood out to me was when one of the people took the foil blanket and placed it on one of the other people. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that symbolism?
Yeah, so many of the things that are in the visuals are things that I, because of lack of space or of time, I wanted to include in the film, but not through voice. So for instance, that part when we're using the aluminum foil, it's based on a testimony from a person who, while they were at the border, they were sent to this thing called la nevera, or the fridge, which is a place where they process refugees after they cross. And it's a place that is very, very cold. I don't know if they do it on purpose or not, but I mean, after people have crossed the border, many have crossed through the river. It's a place that people have a very bad time because it is so intentionally cold, or they're sleeping outside. And the only thing that they get is this aluminum foil to cover themselves. And something that it was important for me was also to highlight that even though this process of migrant precarity are real, there was also the need for me to show that something that keeps or like provides agency for the migrants is the fact that they have each other and they have these systems of care that they create for themselves in these very migrant precarious places. So that was basically a story. I can tell you more specifically, with someone whose child was having fever. And I think it was because the child was also in distress, like they were in a place that they didn't know, they wanted to go home, and they were they were having fever, but then the mother was scared of telling the police officers because they could take the child from her. So then this group of women, they just decided to cover each other, and they were like trying to wash the kid and like provide things for the kid to see if the fever would go down. And then when she told me this, she was really saying it was the women at the end of the day who took care of themselves in that space. So I wanted to symbolize through that gesture, perhaps, that moment.
Mm. Were there any particular challenges in making this film that stand out to you for yourself and in even your crew and even the people that you were interviewing?
Yeah, I think personally for me, making the film was something that it was like very emotionally heavy, as I was very far away from the reality of these women, but I was also feeling very connected to, and like going through the process of research in itself is something that like I think it deeply changed me, and that I honor that I have these women within me now. There's like a Pamela before and a Pamela after. And I think, I mean, the challenge was that I was trying to use sociological or ethnographic research to make the film, but I was also in a very constricted time period because it was for my capstone, and I was trying to explain many things to an audience that doesn't necessarily understand the realities within Latin America, right? So they wanted more explicitness, and I was like, no, because ultimately, I mean, it's not that this film is not for you, but it was like I want to make this film for someone else, and that's something that I ended up that's why I chose using the captions and subtitles as parts of the visuals, because I did not want to compromise on just highlighting the meaning of one voice, even though it's a cacophony of voices, right? And that comes at a cost because sometimes people focus too much on the text and not the visuals. And interestingly, when I showed the film in Venezuela, people gave me a completely different feedback, which was that, oh, we're so exhausted of listening to these stories that are from our own families, that we want to hear other stories that are being heard about Venezuela and necessarily outside of migration. So that was something that really impacted me, because it also made me recognize how my position as like as a Venezuelan that is now part of the diaspora, being 7 years abroad, is also entering into Venezuela with a completely different perception. So that was a humbling experience as well.
Can you discuss a little bit the reasons, what's happening in Venezuela and the reasons for migration happening and people needing to leave and flee the country?
Yeah. So I was born in 1998, so I was born under the Chavismo. I think the current political regime, which I think is worth differentiating between Chavez and Maduro, uh, was one that came out of deep discontent, social discontent back then, out of the previous political parties that had monopolized uh, kind of the political life in Venezuela. So there was definitely a sort of, there's a recognition for neglect and inequality that was pre-existing to the Chavismo, and I think that's worth clarifying. Having said that, Venezuela was always a country that it was like it was a monoproductive country, so we would depend highly on oil, and that was great for people because oil prices were like super high. But at the same time, during Chavez, I mean, oil was already nationalized, but there was not really a clear economic project to diversify our economy. And on top of that, I feel like Chavez, even though it had a lot of ideas of like how do you say, like public policy, that it was to serve the people, there was not really there was also a lot of I want to say polarization of society, in a way that the middle class was villainized, in a way in which the high class was also like super villainizing of Chavez. So then this polarization with the society ended up producing a lot of harm, to the point in which, like, after the coup in 2002, which, I mean, I was like 4 years old, so and I'm not like a political scientist, but I can tell you from my experience is that after that coup, which was in itself unconstitutional, but it was also the reality that people were protesting because they wanted to change the constitution to extend the presidential period to 8 years, and also wanted to make it indefinite so he could stay in power forever. Made it so that after he came back from power, he came with a lot of like revenge, and he did a lot of things that did harm the Venezuelan economy, because it destroyed the local industry. I think it's very different when we talk about like agrarian reform, which I totally support, and but would do it in a way that does not really take into account the rest of civil society, but it's like, oh, we are going to do these things, but we're going to like ostracize the people that are against us, is something that ended up paying back at us. And then when Chavez died in 2013, it was just exactly when oil prices dropped. So a lot of people that used to support Chavez think that then what we're living today, since 2016, we have been living in scarcity of goods and services. So like I remember there was like toilet scarcity, and that was way before the sanctions by the US. People think and attribute those challenges to Maduro because he came after, but the reality is that Chavez had been ongoing like already for 10 years, a sort of like destruction of the local industry that made us in this position in which we then became more reliant on oil revenues. And then when we didn't have them anymore, what we had a scarcity of stuff and goods. And yeah, I mean, that, I'm sorry, this is like a long backtrack, but it is to say that it is complicated, and it is to say that there's a lot of responsibility of the Chavismo regime, while also acknowledging that until today, and even back then, authoritarian practices started like happening. So a lot of I remember I was like 7 years old, and then they were like closing all of these TV channels, right? And then the only thing that was remaining were like state-owned channels. So then the idea of freedom of expression in itself was also being reduced and like censored. And I have had friends who are political prisoners, who have been taken to jail for speaking against the regime. So I think what's happening in Venezuela right now, and it has changed it's not the same type of socioeconomic crisis that we were facing maybe 7 or 10 years ago when there was like hyperinflation, because now our economy has like informally dollarized, which is in itself a disgrace, but also it's like something that has kind of stabilized the rate of inflation. It's a result of decades of just, I want to say, economic obstruction and social obstruction, and the refugee crisis is a response to this. It's a response of people wanting to not only want civil and economic rights, but also political rights.
Wow, thank you for that. And I think that's part of the issue, that people who aren't directly involved in or even knowledgeable, I appreciate you educating us. I feel like your film is attempting to challenge narratives about migration. There's a whole like bunch of propaganda that happens in the United States, that doesn't really give a face to the people and the challenges that they're facing. And I just in the name of your film, it already starts to make you question why we view someone who crosses the border for seeking a life, that's better for them. Why do we view them as the other? Why do we call them, illegal aliens, which is an incredibly derogatory term? So I wanted to ask you what was that the reason why you named it that film? And if you can tell us a little more about that.
Yeah. When I was in my undergrad, I was taking a class on migration in the United States. It was migration in the Americas, but it was actually migration about the United States. And then I got to learn just a tiny bit about how the law works here, how violent it can be. Even BAWAD, which is the one that is supposed to protect women from domestic violence. When you're a migrant and you experience domestic violence, you're actually put in a position of precarity, because the state can protect you from your perpetrator, but it does not guarantee you the possibility of of livelihood. You're not legally, uh, you're not you're not allowed to work if you are under this visa. You can be under the shadows for 7 years until the state decides whether or not you're a victim of gender violence, which is an insane thing to do. Um, so I feel like for me the title juxtaposed within the images, because the aliens at the end of the day are made to show to the audience that these aliens are actual humans. It's like the painting is not done to reciprocate Avatar if it's a real thing. No, it is to show you that if this is something constructed and under this painted skin there is a human. It's something that I wanted to make I wanted to make people question, as we just normalize so much of the legal language in our daily discourse.
What sort of impact do you want your audience to receive, or how do you want your audience to react when they see this film?
That's hard because it depends on who it is. But I feel like for my Venezuelan audience, I wanted to just visualize how difficult migration is, because the reality is that a lot of people are also living almost as this response that everybody else is doing it, therefore I can also do it, but they don't really necessarily know what is the journey in itself. And a lot of them encounter very difficult and challenging circumstances because they were not financially, emotionally, physically prepared. A lot of people staying behind in the jungle, like in the Darien jungle, people die there because it is a very physically difficult journey. And I wanted to first of all show for the people that decide to migrate and to take this journey, to know that this is some of the realities. Of course, it's not all encompassing, but this is something that people have experienced, and I think is worth taking seriously. At the same time, that I hope that people, other Venezuelans and other people that see the new waves of migration because they come from a different socioeconomic status, have compassion and empathy for these people that are migrating, because the reality is that Venezuelan society is also very classist, and this is something that we don't want to talk about, right? So it's the fact that the Venezuelans who migrated 20 years ago because they were engineers from oil, that now have been in the United States for 20 years, also have an ideological uh, understanding of migration that is different from the people that are migrating today. And that comes from the fact that they want to implement their understanding of Venezuelan society here. And that in itself is classist, is racist, is something that it's we have to talk about within our communities. Yeah. And I hope they understand that. I don't know if they get that, but this is my hope.
I think we have time for one more question. And what was your collaboration like making this film? What kind of resources or people, or how did you gather your crew, and how did that inform your practice in this film?
Yeah, so it was part of my thesis. So I had people to work with that were students like me, and interestingly, there was this dynamics happening that there were people who were caring for each other's work, and there's people who ultimately don't think of filmmaking as a collaborative process. And I was more interested in people in which we could collaborate. So that year, as I was making my film, I was also like being the assistant director and the DP of other projects, and these people were also part of my capstone. So it was a process of reciprocating. And at the same time, even though I couldn't make it with this film, something that I was learning um, through other experiences is the idea of making films with people as opposed to about them, which is something that I definitely don't do with this film, because it was also acknowledging that these women were up to having this conversation, but they did not necessarily want it to be part of the process. I asked them, sometimes you want to be like, hey, are you comfortable with me sharing this or not sharing this? And many of them were not necessarily like having the time or energy to even do that. So that's also that I learned that not every process needs to be collaborative, but there's these two filmmakers, and I forgot their names, but they're from India, and I was at a festival there, and they were just talking about how life-changing for them it is to make films with other people. And as I am hoping to envision my next film, which will be in the Darien Jungle, and I want it to be a feature, I hope to bring that to the process. Considering that I am an outsider to the Darien, to wanting to recognize that the only way for me to show that the Darien is not only liminal space in which migrants are passing by, but it's also space where communities live. It's a place of livelihood, and so much beyond the fact that it's considered this inhabitable space that I completely like don't want to portray, is the fact that I will need to include people from the community in my process of filmmaking. So that's why the research will take longer, but I think it is important.
Well, I'm extremely um, excited to see what else is going to come from you, and you are phenomenal in how much consideration you have taken, and the knowledge that you carry. And so I hope to see you continue, and can't wait to see what the next film is going to look like. And so before we close our session, I just wanted to ask you, to open the floor and see if there's anything else that's, in your heart or in your mind that you'd like to share with the audience right now.
I just want to say that thank you so much for giving me this space. Also, I feel like acknowledging that all of the films that we made are related to our political lives. I mean, the personal is political, but also I appreciate that you ask about what was my perception of Venezuela, because the reality that I've also encountered, I find myself in these spaces sometimes in which, because people want to homogenize ideas, they don't want to go into the nuances of the lived experience that my family until today lives as they are in Venezuela. And it is something that then also alienates us from other peoples. And within Latin America, I feel like I never understood myself as a Latin American up until I left, because to me it was just this construction of like, oh, we're Latin Americans because we're not from the US, because the US wants to claim the American. But actually, as I have migrated, I've found so much community with other people from other countries, because the reality is that the nationhood or the nation state identity is not something that binds me or connects me with other people. It's something else. And that's something that I feel like I appreciate so much from these spaces in which we can all share our experiences, and ultimately to think of Latin America or even the global South as a space that also thinks and creates and is worth of listening. It's something that I carry, and I appreciate that. I feel like in this space I can bring.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And thank you for being a part of today's panel. Just to let people know that you can learn more about the Philadelphia Latino Film Festival going to the website, and stay tuned for more events and for the film festival coming up. And just thank you so much, Pam Martinez, for joining us, and you have a beautiful day.
Thank you, you too. Thank you.